Good evening, everybody, and welcome to SPOW 25. My name is Annette Vrijberg-Inaan. I'm a professor in international relations at the Department of Political Science of the University of Amsterdam. And I've been involved in organizing this event together with Alexandra Komornicka, sitting here in the front, who is assistant professor of European history at the University of Maastricht, and with Jasper Simons, sitting here, who is assistant professor of European studies at the University of Utrecht, who will be our moderator tonight. In the coming hour and a half, we will take stock of the changing position and significance of the Central and Eastern European region in Europe and vis-à-vis Europe, writ large. And to do so, we bring together three excellent scholars with different backgrounds and complementary expertise on the region. The panel discussion will be followed by a Q&A, so you'll have an opportunity to participate and ask questions and raise points. And after that, there'll also be an opportunity to continue the conversation informally over drinks. My job is easy. Besides welcoming you, I just have to introduce our panelists. So in alphabetical order, we have André Gerrits, in black, who is a historian and professor of international studies at Leiden University. He was previously professor of Russian politics and history at the same university, and before that, Jean Monnet, professor of European Union studies at the University of Amsterdam. He's also worked at the Institute for International Relations Klingendahl and holds positions at several non-governmental organizations working on issues affecting the region. Gerrits has researched and shared his expertise on a very broad range of topics. It's impossible to enumerate them all here, but recently also on the historical context and the implications of the war against Ukraine. Ferenc Lotzo, here right next to me, is assistant professor in history at Maastricht University and an editor at the Review of Democracy, which is the journal of the Democracy Institute of Central European University. This year, he's also Istvan Deák visiting professor at Columbia University, so I guess we're lucky you are here right now and not at Columbia University. Lotzo focuses, among other topics, on political and intellectual history, the history of mass violence, and the history of memory. Last not least, we have Karolina Pomorska, who is associate professor at the Institute of Political Science at Leiden University, so a colleague of André Gerrits. She has previously worked at Maastricht University and the University of Cambridge, and her main area of interest is foreign and security policy in the European Union, with a special focus on Eastern neighbors and the role of the member states in Central and Eastern Europe. She's currently co-authoring a book on populist foreign policies, and she's co-leading a project on the agency of Central and Eastern European states in international relations. Thank you so much, all you wonderful speakers, for coming and talking to us tonight. And I will now hand over to Jasper.
Does it work? Yes. Okay, great. Thanks, thanks a lot, Annette, for introducing our excellent panel. Let me say just really briefly a couple of words on the central theme of today's or tonight's discussion. If you think about the region, Central and Eastern Europe, we are basically about 35 years almost after the fall of the Iron Curtain, right? Almost 20 years after the Big Bang first round of accession of post-communist member states to the EU. And we thought, okay, this is a pretty good time to sort of take stock of the region and doing so from a sort of structural perspective. So what we would like to do is to zoom out a little bit and think about the position of the region as a whole and its constituent parts in European politics. And the idea basically is, okay, we could approach this subject from sort of the perspective of the ascendancy of the region, and then also, question mark, its perhaps growing significance to European politics. So that's the central theme. We have, and also previously communicated to our panelists, three different themes, but what I propose to do is to do this in a very loose kind of way. So we would just really like to have a conversation, an exchange of thoughts, and we will just see how it goes. So we have these three different themes, which we will go through one after another, but it's not necessarily done in a very rigid kind of way. So let's just have an interesting exchange of ideas. These three themes basically are, first, let's say, economic development, afterwards regional politics, and then the main theme probably international politics, or the role of Central Eastern Europe in European and therefore by extension also international politics. So we do a panel discussion of almost 1 hour, then there is time for Q&A, and you can ask questions, the audience can, to the panelists over a drink in the reception. Okay, now it's a bit better. So let's start with the economic. My first main question, very broad, and I'm very curious about your opinion here. So after the whole turbulence of post-communist transition from 1989 for about a decade or so, the region has of course changed a lot in a structural sense, in a structural economic sense. What is your general attitude towards this whole trajectory of about 35 years? Do you look at the economic development of the region positively? Do you distinguish perhaps between macroeconomic and socioeconomic issues? Do you distinguish certain countries in a certain way? So I thought let's start off with a very big question.
Good. Let's begin with the issue I know least about. Well, first of all, I mean, we have to pose the question: what is the area that we are covering here? I'm not sure which abbreviation or which abbreviation or term you use. Was it East Central Europe?
Yeah, or Central and Eastern Europe.
Central and Eastern Europe. So it's everything. It's basically everything in between the old European Union and today's Russia. Yeah. So I mean, I've never believed in the notion of Central Europe, to be honest, which basically, of course, is a cultural notion and a political, historical one to a certain extent, not necessarily an economic one. Mm-hmm. If you overlook the whole area, from the east of Germany all the way to the west of Russia, I think the economic picture probably is the least controversial, at least that's how I see it. The whole area, including the poorer countries, Bulgaria, Romania, and even the former Soviet republics, Belarus, Moldova, they've all gone through a process of dramatic change, dramatic modernization, and everything which comes with it, including, you already made that difference between the macroeconomic developments and microeconomic ones. Obviously, you should also make a distinction between overall macroeconomic modernization and its social implications or consequences. But even then, I'm too much of a liberal to not argue that overall, I think this, the history of post-communism, I was thinking about it yesterday, coming back from Poland yesterday evening, and I was listening to two French scholars, totally by accident, in the plane, who were talking about the Trente Glorieuses. And actually, to a certain extent, that also applies to a large part of East Central Europe, I would argue. Taking into account all the social consequences and perhaps the growing inequality, I'm old enough to have experienced communism. I even lived there. I mean, well, also in that part of Europe, but mostly in Russia. And I know the differences. But I wouldn't argue that there is much nostalgia for communism, not even among the, let's say, the lower layer, socioeconomically speaking, of society. So to make a long story very short, I would argue the economic dimension is perhaps one of the most positive ones, overlooking the history, the 30-year history of post-communist transition.
Okay. You share one. Yeah, Carolina, thank you.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, so I agree with Andrea, with what you said, and also what you said about the region, because we are starting discussing, the main theme, and we are talking about Central Eastern Europe, but I think we have to remember that the countries in that region were very reluctant to be treated as a bloc, right? In the 1990s, I think, Andrea, you talked about the construction, as a historian, also construction of the concept. As a political scientist, I also remember kind of politically and strategically, they were reluctant to be seen as we are all those Central Eastern Europeans, and we are not that similar. And I think it was the enlargement and the accession negotiations that kind of pushed them together. And I think we will talk about it in our next theme, but they've always been reluctant. And I think now Poland has been, I'm going to talk mostly about Poland later, and Poland had been a very ambiguous, strange situation there where other countries were, sometimes wanted the leadership, but also fearing it, and a very strange position of Poland there. But I think we will come to talk about it. So we have to keep it in mind. Yes, we talk about the region, but we need to remember that these are very different countries as well. And I agree that in a sense, the economic dimension is the least problematic. And there was a lot of progress talking about Poland, a lot of pride, even with the government of Tusk. The government used to be very proudly calling Poland the green island on the map of Europe, and always showing this map, red, Western Europe, and green growth. And that continued when peace came to power. And very shallow COVID recession, and then good recovery, right? Good long-term perspectives, and now being one of the kind of motors of economic growth in the EU. But of course, also leader in economic growth, but also inflation, we have to say, which is very evident for people living in Poland and in the region. But there are still a lot of also challenges to that came with it, and you already mentioned, the social challenges that came with that, with the very rapid growth, and then some. I think I don't know about other countries that well, but I think in general some social groups felt left behind. Right? They did feel maybe nostalgic because they didn't see the change as positive. There was a certain group of society, right, that they felt left behind, and clearly populist parties also played on that, right, played their cards and used it. And they said, we are here to defend you, with also anti-Western European discourse. This was too much, this was too fast. So this was, I think, the kind of side effect of that positive story and of the positive development. Right.
Okay. Thank you so much. I would very much agree with what Andrea and Carolina have just said, but I think it also very much depends on the kind of measure or the kind of standard we take. If you take a global approach, this region is in a sense part of the developed world. They are in the top 25% or so of countries across the globe. If you take a European approach, I think in many ways they are still quite peripheral, in fact. And here I would maybe try to nuance what has just been said, and I'm very much aware that Poland and a number of these countries have developed really exceptionally, and have also caught up with some of the parts of Europe that used to belong to the Western part during the Cold War. But if you look at, for example, statistics like the 20 poorest regions within the EU, I happen to come from Hungary. 5 out of 7 of the regions of Hungary are in the poorest 20. I think 6 out of 7 in Bulgaria, and I think 6 out of 8 in Romania. And then the rest, that's almost 20 already, but the rest is Eastern Slovakia and Eastern Poland. So there's still very much, I think, a peripheral area within the European Union, which is significantly poorer than the rest. And I think that's important to keep in mind, even if core periphery relations have really, I think, changed, and I'm sure we'll talk a lot about that. Maybe just to add some nuance, I was also thinking of the negatives, and I think you both highlighted, and very rightly so, the positive development. So let me try to maybe say just a few words on what I see as some of the big shortcomings. One is that these economies, and again, Poland is a partial exception, these economies are still very much dependent on foreign investment, right? Wages are really quite low, also compared to productivity, right? That's one of the big contrasts with Southern Europe, where productivity is often lower, but wages are higher. And that's, of course, a serious problem for people living in these countries. There's still mass emigration from many of these countries. Also, well, you see it in the Netherlands, right? We have students from Central and Eastern Europe in huge numbers, which is very good for us, but maybe not necessarily so good for some of the countries that are sending these students, I would say. And that, of course, connects to what, for me personally, is one of the biggest shortcomings, being an academic. We don't have world-class universities in this region. If you look at rankings of universities and how they perform, I think Prague in the Czech Republic and Tartu in Estonia are the two exceptions that are in the top 200 or so. But otherwise, it's almost exclusively Western European. So I think these are, so to say, the dark sides of what is overall, and I very much agree with what's been said before, is a success story.
Does any of you want to respond to these points, perhaps?
My overall positive interpretation, of course, my overall positive interpretation does not exclude the issues which you mentioned. And one of the more remarkable thing is that, let's say, the gaps weren't really bridged. So, as you mentioned, the gap between these countries, when they entered the European Union, they were, I think, all of them were poorer than the then poorest member state, which was Portugal. And probably they still are, that's one. And the other gap that was never bridged was, of course, between the capital cities and the countryside, which you also rightly mentioned. I remember that in Poland they refer to Poland A and Poland B, which was not just a geographical distinction, but also a socio-economic one, of course, of which the Peace Party, of course, exploited. So I guess when you take all of our interventions together, you indeed have that full picture. It's not just a rosy picture, that's obvious.
Would you like to add something, Caroline? Or okay. Then I would like to pick up on several of the things that Ferenc mentioned, and then to use that as a segue to go into the regional and international politics. Namely, you mentioned foreign direct investment. You mentioned the keyword periphery. Well, these post-communist countries are very much or very often thought about as being sort of the semi-periphery. They are dependent countries. And my question to you is how is that economic status of being dependent on foreign investment and so on, whether it's the car manufacturing industry or banking or whatever, many of the sectors, how does that relate to the potential or the capacity to have a strong outward focus? So how does the economic dependency relate to outward politics of Central Eastern European countries, with disambiguation for the differences among the region?
May I leave it to my neighbors?
You may. It's a difficult question, I know.
Yeah,
but
this is a very difficult question in a sense, and maybe that what you mentioned, this situation contributed to the feeling of being kind of, that is very much present in the part of political elites and citizens, of being still treated maybe like, as, in a way, second-class category EU member state, whether true or not, right? But this discourse is there, being still treated a bit like a student that has to do the homework, right? That was the case after enlargement, but still, sometimes, there is the feeling like that, even among diplomats in Brussels, that they still have to always have to catch up, right? So this is still there. But maybe we have to remember that this kind of performance, positive economic performance, of course, gives more confidence, what we mentioned already before. And that's, I think, so there are again two sides to this story, right? That on one hand, yes, there is this realization that we are periphery, and I think we are going to talk about it again, but we are doing so well. But still, we always kind of are treated a bit differently. And I think we have to keep it very much in mind when we think of future enlargement as well.
Could you perhaps give an example of one of these forms of confidence that you've observed? Like, where do you see that confidence in?
So I see the confidence, but definitely there is a kind of, especially when we talk about Poland, right? But also maybe of Hungary. There is, I don't know if it's a confidence, but there is very strong assertiveness. And this is close to something I work on at the moment, which which we call populist foreign policy. And this is not so much linked to international politics, but really how populist parties construct their foreign policy in a sense that they kind of domesticate it. So many issues discussed in Brussels or, I don't know, in outside world, what they do, they hijack it and they talk to their audience at home and not so much to their negotiating partners or audiences in other countries. And it's confusing sometimes because this kind of level of assertiveness sometimes is kind of against their interest. So as one of the diplomats told me, it's sometimes it's not about what we achieve, but how loud we say things and how strongly we kind of bang on the table, right? Because for populist governments, it's very important to be seen as heroes at home, as kind of champions of national interest, as is for others too, but here this is much stronger. And they do not care maybe that much about the reputation outside, right? So they don't care about being troublemakers, whereas it's one of the norms, for example, in the European Union that's very much respected, that you try to build consensus because there are too many member states, if everybody pushes all the time, it's just not going to work. Whereas I think in the case of Hungary and Poland, to a lesser extent, it has changed, right, under the populist government. So they kind of changed the game and they domesticated those issues. They say, well, we are going to act very strongly. Maybe we don't achieve that much, but we are going to see it at home and at our party-based electorate as being strong. Right? So we see for sure this assertiveness, and we see it, you can read about it in the news. Well, now about Hungary all the time threatening, or actually vetoing when it comes to military aid to Ukraine and other, possible enlargement. Poland being more, in the shadow, but also what we hear from diplomats inside the who are in negotiations is that they are also problematic, right? So there is assertiveness, but I would say, for example, it will be nice to see now with the change of government in Poland, how this is going to change. Then maybe it will be assertiveness, but more positive. Kind of, we want to be strong player, but ready to kind of be also consensual.
Maybe one thing I'd like to highlight in connection with what has just been said is that, I look at this also very much historically, but when you have this new EU in the early 21st century, originally with 28 and now with 27 member states, nearly half of the member states of this union are from the post-communist world, right? I like to say 11 1/4 if you add the Eastern German territory, that becomes the Neue Bundesländer. And that is, of course, nearly half of the power when it comes to certain positions, right? Whether on the council, commissioners, votes, and so what have you, which is, of course, something that makes these countries overrepresented. Because, neither the demography nor the economic level of development is nearly half of the EU. These are mostly small nation states, where Poland is, of course, the largest, Romania the second largest, but many of them are relatively small, right? That's where, of course, the history comes in, that these are states that emerge out of imperial collapse and fragmentation. In practically all the cases, Poland is, again, a bit of an exception as it's being restored in the 20th century. But that is, of course, a very peculiar discrepancy for the European Union, because it means that if you think about European transnational networks, European elites, members of these societies are much less represented in those, because most of them are Western European and most of them go back generations or even centuries. Whereas based on the nation-state principle, they have a lot of power. And that, I think, creates a very strangely, I wouldn't call it disbalanced, but a very strange tension within the Union, right? These are countries that are able to assert themselves via the national principle, much more so than via the transnational. And I think that structural background, in fact, to my mind, it explains a lot of what has been happening politically. Yeah.
André, do you share this analysis?
Well, I think I do. Well, in the meantime, we have already reached the domain of international relations, actually, and the role of Central and East European countries in the European Union. Yeah, it's difficult to exactly ascertain their role and their weight. I think Ferenc slightly over-exaggerates the actual weight of the former communist countries within the realm of European integration. I also think that it's almost impossible to talk about a, let's say, a common denominator when it comes to this part of Europe within the process of European integration or within the wider process of transatlantic relations. I mean, many of these countries, but we'll discuss that, disagree on basically everything. Relations with Ukraine, relations with Russia, relations with Germany, relations with the United States, the security role of Europe, those kind of things. So I always find it extremely difficult to talk in those very general terms about the role and relevance of this part of Europe in the wider European integration process. Having said this, I tend to agree with what the two other panelists have said thus far. Yeah.
Well, then maybe let's try to unpack this a little bit more. So let's talk a bit about shared interest and the potential for cohesive agency, perhaps even in the region. We've already noted that there's a lot of diversity. You already briefly mentioned several different issues, including some more current ones. But let's perhaps try to take a bit more of a sort of structural, longer-term view. Like, what are the main sort of dividing lines in the region that might be relevant for their shared or cohesive type of agency externally? So whether that would be the EU, if you would like to perceive it as somewhat external, it of course isn't completely, but you see what I mean, beyond the national border. So how does, like, what are the main lines of differences? How could we approach this?
Just a few words. I mean, this is an important question, of course. What are these main lines of difference? Equally important question is where do they come from, actually? And what I would be interested in is to what extent are these differences, and we will go into these differences, to what extent are they, do they result from different historical experiences, different experiences with the Soviet Union, so with Russia, with the western part of Europe, or to what extent are these differences, which have already partially been mentioned, are they basically defined by current politics? So by the political personalities, by the political ideologies, by the political ideas of those in power. And I tend to, my interpretation, but it differs perhaps not per topic, but it can differ per topic. I think we tend to underestimate the, let's say, the issue of political agency, the agency of those who are in power, and we tend to overestimate the historical causes and origins of these differences. Having said that, again, there are major historical differences, particularly, of course, when you talk about relations with Russia, which is a bit closer to my home turf. But again, I would argue there are structural differences between these countries, but there are also very powerful political ones. And we'll see to what extent my feeling is right, as Caroline already indicated. We're all anxious to see to what extent the policies of the Polish government with regard to the rule of law, with regard to Brussels, but also with regard to Germany, to what extent these policies will change under the impact of a new government, if the new government will be formed, of course. That's still a question.
Yes, we could talk about it for a while. Maybe there will be questions. I'm listening a lot now to Polish news. It suddenly became even more interesting. But I have no doubt it will change. And I also have almost no, pieces out, unless, of course, they will resort to, again, something almost unthinkable. But, you know, I'm pretty positive about that. And also, you know, to say something very positive about the region, which I am, you know, it's not only the outcome of the election, but the turnout. I have to say it. I was thinking about it when we discussed the region. I mean, you know, turnout over 70%, 83% turnout in, you know, Warsaw region, my region, Gdańsk region. This is extremely good news for democracy, also in Poland, but hopefully also in the region, when people, you know, it was higher than in 1989. I'm sorry to hijack a little bit the discussion, but this is really, really good sign that people are, you know, that people want to vote. But coming back again to CEs and lines of differences, it was much easier to talk about it before the populist governments came to power in Hungary and Poland. Because when we discussed, you know, I don't know, let's say relationship of the EU with Ukraine, with Russia, we always talked about Visegrad, so Visegrad group plus B3. So Visegrad and the Baltics had very straightforward and similar position. right, towards those countries, towards, I don't know, championing Ukrainian membership, being much stricter on Russia, and so on and so on. But it became complicated, indeed, at least, with Hungary, with Poland, not so much, but there were some nuances here. In the area I research, so foreign and security policy, we always say that the dividing line in Europe is not west-east, but north-south. And this is very much geopolitically, I think, sound also now. So there was always a competition. I used to sit in the council as well. There was a competition between countries who thought we need to be more engaged in the East, geopolitically, but also with money, with everything, and those who said, no, we need to really look in the South. Right? And here, I think a lot of countries from the region were always, from CE, were always on the side, we need more engagement, we need more attention, we need you to pay attention to the East. They had differences, maybe, how to do it, but they all advocated, they need to be on your radar, those neighbors, right? Which they weren't after the enlargement. So I think this was something they had in common. And now I think because of the war, because of Russia's aggression, again, that somehow brings the countries together with some exception, again. But this is, I think, for that, it's important to keep in mind what Andres said, how much of that is a factor of the government that is in power in Hungary, hopefully soon in Poland, and to what extent this is, this might, again, change.
Maybe one thing to add, I mean, certainly there's a lot of inner diversity. And one thing I tend to notice a lot is how Poland is often seen as some kind of regional leader. It sort of has the role of being a spokesperson for Central and Eastern Europe on many fora. Whereas I would argue that this is not necessarily the view from within Central and Eastern Europe. If you go to Sofia, Bucharest, Belgrade, Budapest, what have you, Poland is not seen as the center towards you're looking. And that is, of course, again, something that historically is very easy to explain. And we are talking in a way about two slightly different regions. And I think that also nowadays what is very striking for me, if you look at the responses to the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, I think within the Central and Eastern European region, you have both the most vocal supporters of Ukraine and also some of the most problematic countries where either because of the regimes and the governments or because of social attitudes, there is a lot of apologia or reproduction of Russian propaganda narratives and so on, or even veiled support for the Russian ambitions. And here I think the north-south divide is indeed very crucial. And the point is really that this is the region where sort of both extremes are present. And I think that's, again, sometimes underemphasized as if Central and Eastern Europe was the clearest supporter of Ukraine, which I think is not the case. But I think, again, maybe just to put it in slightly different terms, I always wondered whether Poland is the greatest of the small powers or the smallest of the great powers in today's Europe. And I think that's what we're dealing with in a sense, right? Poland can play on different levels. Sometimes, it's in the league with Germany and France, at least seemingly through symbolic politics and all sorts of arrangements. At other times, it, of course, is trying to play the regional leader card, the V4, which, again, I think nowadays is no longer very tenable. I just had an exchange with the person, Miroslav Lachovsky, who's been the foreign minister of Slovakia earlier this year, and he was basically telling me, well, the V4 has practically become defunct since the start of the Russian war of aggression. They used to meet in advance of European negotiations and they haven't done that in this now more than a year and a half. So in a sense, you can forget about it. And well, his point is that the change of government in Slovakia and in Poland will only reproduce this, in fact.
Just maybe to add to that, I completely agree with you about both Visegrad and Poland. And there were always fears from the region from the 90s that Poland kind of would dominate, at least maybe not that far south, as you mentioned, but even with the neighbors. And I remember reading about exchanges between Havel and Wałęsa when Visegrad was formed. And indeed the countries and Havel, and so they were saying, let's not institutionalize this too much, let's keep it informal, because they didn't want it to be kind of too strong as a kind of forum where Poland could dominate. But then I think very quickly it ran out of steam, like you say, and I was also looking very suspiciously at ideas to reinvigorate it. It became very clear to me that there was an intention by Orbán to see it as a forum of gaining legitimacy, which he was losing in the European Union, but in order to say at home, I matter in international politics, look at the Visegrad summit. And then when the government changed in Poland, hey, again, there was Visegrad. But as you already said, there was hardly any agreement. It was not really, it was never really very functional. And I think we are going to come to the 3Cs initiative,
yeah, please.
Which also, I don't know, maybe there will be new impetus now, so...
Maybe you can first describe to the audience what it basically is.
Right, so that was an initiative, I think, in 2015 that was taken by Polish president and Slovenia, right? Slovenian, I think, prime minister. But it's Poland and Slovenia, 2015, and the idea of cooperation between the 3Cs, so Adriatic, Black Sea, and the Baltic. And you have to know that also in Poland, there is a discourse of power, of Poland being from sea to sea. So they were very strange, I think, maybe not known outside, but inside of Poland there was a very strong message also with that we again are creating something that will show kind of our power in international relations between the seas. But it was kind of, at least in the beginning, it now has 12 members. It was thought to be something of a cooperation, especially in the area of infrastructure or economics. Right? And from the beginning, treated with suspicion from other member states of the EU who worried, is this going to be somehow competitive? Which I think one has to say there is logic behind it, because even now when you think about the infrastructure that's needed for energy diversification and so on, transport, improving transport routes. I mean, there are many pragmatic reasons why this cooperation 3Cs, or however we would call it, would work out, but it hasn't really. So I think now out of 50 projects, only 2 were completed, and it's really more of, I think, a show than really, again, a legitimization project, than really something that maybe now, with the tragic, Russia's aggression in Ukraine, maybe there could be more meaning that could be given to this initiative because it's there. And I have to say, that also the fact that Trump came and one of the summits in Warsaw, that again was kind of, sparked all kind of different comments in the region, but again was very much played as a triumph and saying, look, we have our strong initiative here as well. But I think it could be meaningful. I'm not sure the new well, let's see again how the new government will treat it. There is a potential, but it not in a way, I think, how it was treated so far.
Well, I mean, I don't know about the audience. I wasn't even aware of this 3Cs initiative before I did some reading for this panel, to be honest. And I was thinking about Poland from sea to sea. What is that other sea? Probably the Black Sea, but then we have to go back quite a few hundred years, together with Lithuania, as a matter of fact. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, you were talking about a show, and I tend to agree with your interpretation, but a show for whom, actually?
Domestic audience.
Domestic audience again, yeah, it's possible. On the other hand, I mean, I don't know. I mean, what I see is a sort of a resurgence of, if you don't take me too seriously, a sort of a resurgence of Polish overcompensation or exaggeration of their own position and also their own geopolitical position in Europe. I mean, we all know obviously how decision-making works in the European Union. The weight is basically based on demographics. That's the major reason why Poland is a relatively important country, because economically, of course, it's much less so. And geopolitically, I don't know. I always have the idea that the Poles tend to overestimate their own geopolitical relevance. Also, all those arguments saying that, due to the invasion, Russia's invasion of Ukraine 2014 and last year, let's say, the geopolitical center in Europe in a way has moved to the east. I doubt that. There are so many differences between the countries in this part of Europe, and both of you have mentioned, and me as well, have mentioned those differences, that I don't really see, and mostly because of these differences, I don't really see this geopolitical weight necessarily in this part of Europe. And I don't really think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine changed that situation. It sounds a bit like, you know, adding nuance to the reason why we have this discussion in the first place, because there is, of course, this general feeling that East Central Europe has become a much more important part of the continent as a result of the war. I tend to doubt that, mostly because of what we have been discussing for the last 40 minutes. That's the deep divisions, also geopolitical divisions and geostrategic divisions among these countries.
Okay, so if some people, and you were alluding to this, some people are thinking, okay, maybe over time, you know, if we take a bit of a sort of educated guess into the future, over time, Poland could potentially be a competitor to France in the Franco-German axis. That's what some people sometimes say, right? Germany has traditionally always had a much clearer eye also on the East. But of course, in recent years, the relationship between Germany and Poland has not been great. You know, the whole thing about yes, we're talking about diplomacy, so I express myself diplomatically. No, but with the whole reparations and so on, right, for the Second World War, etc. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think this idea that Poland could, well, maybe not replace, but maybe on some issues take the position of France in this sort of new kind of axis for European politics? Or do you think it's a nice idea, but not very realistic, at least in the medium term?
No, I mean, it's not going to take the place of France. I think, you know, Franco-German, here the engine, I agree. When you think about where decisions are taken, it's firmly there. But I would say geopolitical importance of the region, I would be more kind of optimistic about it, especially after the elections. And I think, you know, and again, now things changed. Right? I have absolutely no doubt that the Polish-German relations are going to change, and change a lot, right? So I expect them to be very similar to what they were before the peace came to follow, which were quite close, to be honest. Just to think about Sikorski's speech in Berlin, right? About calling Germany being more active, right? So, but I think what they were then doing, which was very smart, and I talked to a former ambassador to the EU who was very experienced, and they used very smartly Weimar Triangle. So Weimar Triangle is Paris, Berlin, Warsaw, which you might not hear about that much, right? Of course, there were some summits, but there was a lot of coordination before important meetings within the EU, outside of the EU. And what the Poles say, you know, we get a seat at the table. We sit with the two really key players. And of course, he said, this is really difficult, Karolina. This is extremely difficult, because it's not that I can come there and say, well, Poland would like that or this, you know. They are going to do many things anyway. But we get to hear them. We might try to convince them. And sometimes I do get my points through. And then he said, when we have this access, that's when also countries and other ambassadors come to me from the region, right? Because this is pragmatic. Right? If I can see, if the three of us can sit around, so I think this is what we could expect in the future. I don't know if it's going to happen, but maybe that Poland can be again at that seat, right? And even with the peace government, we could observe. So something I was looking at is how much Poland was involved in decision-making, planning when it comes to Russia's actions, 2014 in 2022, and it has already changed. Poland was much more, you know, and the Baltics, they were closer to decision-making, and you know, they were listened to much more now compared to 2014. So hopefully with the change of the government, they can become closer. They will not replace France or, you know, be close to France, but maybe they can be at that closer circle, right?
I'm just wondering, Karolina, one of the stated objectives of the current Polish government, is to build the largest army in Europe. I think they literally use these kind of terms, which is an expression, of course, of what I mentioned as, let's say, Poland tends to consider itself slightly more important than it perhaps is in reality. But what do you think will be the new approach of the what will be the approach of the new government? Let's say the Tusk government. Will they have the same type of outspoken ambitions, including building the largest army in Europe?
Well, they already criticized some of that, right? Yes, that's already been criticized. They are going to kind of change. There was, we could talk about that a lot, but they already criticized this. But of course, Poland needs to spend more on, on defense. This is absolutely, there is no question there. And I think all European countries, but it's not this kind of discourse, that we had during peace. So this is just to keep it shortly. I think they will be ambitious. And in that sense, I think there is an opportunity. Yeah, I don't want to talk about opportunity when we talk about the war, but this presented an opportunity for the region to play a more important role if they are smart, right? And they are consensual. If they have the energy to sit with the other partners to convince them. They spent so much energy doing that before, saying, "Please listen to us." There is even before the war, the kind of warnings coming from the Baltics, coming from Poland, coming from the region. And countries in the West still not trusting that and still, saying we don't see it months before the invasion. So again, I think that showed, hopefully, that, there is a potential there, that they needed to be more central, at least in that domain, right, when it comes to security of that part of Europe.
Yes, I tend to agree with this. I think from an epistemological point of view, it became quite clear that you cannot, so to say, dismiss these perspectives. And I think that was quite a big realization. Of course, the debate is still ongoing, right? You may know that, so to say, the most visible discussion with John Mersheimer and his, I would say, quite outrageous statements is exactly part of this debate, right? That you can still tell the history of Central and Eastern Europe while ignoring all the local actors and only focusing on kind of the Moscow imperial vision as the only relevant one. And of course, that is precisely what I think is being criticized by many scholars. And I think that is really a significant change, but it's more a change in discourse or in, so to say, academic discussion. And I would very much agree with what Andrei said. I think still socioeconomically, this part of Europe is in many ways quite peripheral. The fact that it seems central now is actually historically not novel. If you look at the 20th century, this has been the case over and over again, right? I mean, well, obviously the First World War, the Second World War, in a sense, the end of the Cold War and so on, they all originated in this part of Europe. So the fact that now also many of the crises that are most urgent, that are most burning, whether you look at what is often called the rule of law crisis, certainly the war of aggression against Ukraine, also the whole problem of enlargement, right? All these big questions are in many ways focused on Central and Eastern Europe. That I think is, if you wish, the sign to me that there's a newest wave of this kind of crisis. And again, this kind of duality being peripheral on the one hand and being very central to the so-called historical experiences, or you may also say historical tragedies of Europe, well, that goes back again generations. And I think in that sense, we're living the same kind of history today, unfortunately.
I would say that in general, in the West, there is not, the western part of Europe, there's not that much knowledge of the history of the East and many other current events. But obviously, for very obvious reasons, now the region has become, has gotten much more in the public eye also in the West. Do you think that potentially attitudes here towards the eastern part of the Union might be changing? And a more specific question, so for Poland, of course we've had the whole grain import issue, right? Blocking grain imports from Ukraine to protect Polish farmers, basically. But at the same time, by taking in so many refugees, I forgot to the count, we're on 2 million or something, I think, in Poland alone. It has also gained a lot of diplomatic capital, if you like. So what is your view on sort of the perspective of the West? And we can, of course, distinguish between political elites or the population more generally. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Oh yeah. Now I speak on behalf of the West. Yeah.
You've been framed.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I'm not too sure. You're right. There has generally been a sort of a lack of interest in this part of Europe, and perhaps there has always been more sort of interest and more sort of sympathy even with Russia than with the countries and the lands in between for different reasons. Maybe this is because of what Ferenc said. This has always been this has been a trouble spot in Europe for quite some time. I wouldn't necessarily argue that the two world wars started in Central Europe, but you're absolutely right. Of course, there is a direct historical link. So will public opinion, I can't even speak for the Netherlands, but if I would try to do so, then again, I would be rather careful. I don't think that that the dominant ideas about Central Europe, also within the process of European integration, has changed because of the geopolitical developments and the war recently. I think the image of this part of Europe is still very much dominated by the immediate consequences that it has for our own type of society, which is basically migration. And you're right, Poland now has a much better press than it had before, which is to a large extent, of course, the result of Polish society and also to a certain extent the Polish government response to the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. But overall, I think that it won't make much of a difference in the longer run. I think our dominant perceptions of this part of Europe will remain the lesser developed and somewhat problematic parts of the European Union. And I don't think that the geopolitical developments that we have been talking about for the last 30 minutes will have a large impact on that popular perception. But it's guesswork, obviously. Well, I hope so.
Right, so then you talked about population. Maybe I mentioned something about political elites, because this is something I've been working on, especially political elites within European Union. And there I think there's still a lot of prejudice and a lot of kind of patronizing attitudes. Not always, not everywhere, but they are there, they've been there. And I think now there is a kind of feeling finally in Central Eastern Europe of we don't want that anymore. And I can give you examples. So again, coming back to the region they were always vocal about and being told you're just anti-Russian, right? And I've been in the meetings when they were told, well, you're anti-Russian and kind of you need to change. Whereas, they were warning. Sometimes maybe indeed that was true, but they were saying that. And when the countries, the Baltics or Poland, Lithuania, or Poland, Czech Republic even, were saying, well, but we want to explain to you, we have experience with Russia. We've been, we're the neighbors. And they were saying, no, but your experience and your history makes you too emotional and not objective. Right? And this is not something just anecdotal, but this is a narrative that's coming in a lot of interviews that I've been doing since 2004 and 5, right? So it is kind of denying historical experience and the value coming from that, because you're not really denying that, you've been not denying that when it comes to Spain. Right, and leading on Latin America, you go to the Commission, everybody speaks Spanish in that or External Action Service. So you're not denying this, or French, or Dutch, but this was problematic. I think it started changing, and I hope that again, I'm not overly pessimistic, but I would like to have some hope of that the change that we see now and the apologies we've heard that they are going to be a bit long-term, but I don't know. It also depends what happens in the future. Not only Russia, Ukraine, but who wins elections in America, right, next year. I think that's going to be very important. But what I want to say among the political elites, it's been difficult sometimes, right? There were high-level diplomats who said, I could not mention before the word war. So 2014, I couldn't say war. I said war and I was reprimanded. Even being high-level diplomats, there was a French diplomat or German diplomat who said, no, conflict. Or, you can, so always this kind of language also played a role as a kind of creating power structures in this society, diplomatic society, IR society, right? And now what they are reporting, this has changed. Right, but we will see if it's short or long term, that the expertise is at the moment more valued, that the language had changed, that taboos were broken. when it comes to also language in which European Union is describing what it does towards Russia and so on. The language has changed a lot. But, you know, again, is it going to be long-term or not? We have to see.
Maybe to add to that, you started, Jasper, with the idea that next year there will be the 20th anniversary of the Big Bang enlargement. And I think that's a very interesting moment to go back to, because obviously at that time, I think people were much more optimistic about East-West relations and the possibility that the two halves of Europe would sort of grow together. But I think this was based on quite different expectations, if I may generalize, right? I think in Western Europe, the basic idea was that not much would change just by adding a whole host of countries in Central and Eastern Europe. Whereas in Central and Eastern Europe, the expectation was that there would be substantial equality within Europe, and it would be taken just as seriously as anybody else. And I think the fact that they had these two quite diametrically opposed expectations led to the kind of, if you wish, fallout that we have seen in many ways since, right? Because more has changed than the Western Europeans expected, but less has changed than the Eastern Europeans hoped, right? This is how I would explain it, right? So I think in a way both sides are a bit disappointed with the other, because the Eastern Europeans are louder, more assertive. They have, I think, in many ways also worse reputation than before, or at least their reputation hasn't improved very much, right? Some of the stereotypes are still around. I often say that the interesting thing is that Central and Eastern Europe, well, the generalization is often based on the worst single case. And I often say just because you have a far-right government in Italy, you don't have a more negative opinion about Belgium. Because it's the same thing when you have Orban and then you think Central and Eastern Europe or what have you, right? And this, of course, everybody understands, I think, right? But this is exactly what's, I think, still happening a lot, right? So I think this is, again, an important maybe approach to think about it as a process since 1989 and to try to understand where we have arrived today. And I think, again, I agree with Karolina that a lot might change in the near future, also with the incoming Polish government, which I think will probably dynamize these relations in a new kind of way again.
I can add something. I don't know if many members of our audience, except those from countries in Central Eastern Europe, heard of a term that has been very fashionable and making turns in the media and academic, even circus, which is called West-splaining. Right, West-splaining. So they are West-splaining the war to us. They are West-splaining the region to us. And this was not there before, and this is something that you hear really people, academics, politicians say, and I think it appeared first in the context of Marsheimer. I think that was what really kind of was the drop that contributed, but now it's really used quite a lot. So I think that shows also something, and maybe what you said, this kind of mismatch of expectations.
Okay, I'm doubting. Shall we open the floor to questions? Yes, the answer is yes. So we'll give one mic to you. You take that one. So feel free to ask your questions. As always, keep it as short as possible. The quality of the question has a positive relationship with brevity. So keep it short. That's always best. Thanks. Yeah. Over there.
Hello, my name is Geert Utijn. I teach political science at the Free University. I was actually wondering whether you are talking about the assertiveness of Central Eastern Europe in a way, and I was wondering whether it wasn't actually, you would think that should be positive for some reason. But I think that if we see what Viktor Orban is doing in Hungary and the whole project that he's building around it, that is also an explanation. It might not be a positive one, but it is something, a way of exerting yourself. And that whole project around it is often seen as something that is just to keep power in the West. We are often saying, okay, he's just doing that because he wants to stay in power. This democratic backsliding is just a phase. But maybe we're underestimating this a little bit. And I just read an article by Dorothee Bohle from the Central European University and some of her colleagues. And she was actually making the argument that especially this project from what it is, and that is was also experienced by Kaczynski in Poland. She saw that also as an expression of a related project, not necessarily exactly the same, but a related project nonetheless. And should we not see that as also a very important way of, yeah, how the region expresses itself in European politics?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I agree with you. I probably referred to you as well. And this is what I meant a little bit when I talked about populist foreign policy, this assertiveness at home, so reasserting the national versus the cosmopolitan. So absolutely. So it can be positive or negative. In a sense, it seems to me it also depends who is in power, in a sense, and how they, what outlook they have, and, you know, how they position themselves. Of course, vis-à-vis the European Union, it could be assertive, positive, in a positive way. Of course, everybody is. My God, look at France and how it negotiates at the table. Of course, they are super assertive, but they still, you know, work towards compromise. But you can be also like Hungary and just no, you know. And then also often negotiators are baffled, and they don't know. They even don't know why Hungary says no on certain issues, right? But the Hungarians know, you know, and the government, it's not irrational. It's again to assert themselves at home. So you're completely right, but asserting against something in that case, I think, if it makes sense. And Poland and Hungary are not that different. You know, they are quite, the project Kaczynski was kind of looking up to Orban, and he was quite open about it. He was meeting with him, also sometimes semi-secretive, so he was open about it, that he's learning, right? Learning strategies and learning how to do similar thing in Poland.
Yes, very briefly, you know, I think one, of course, has to add the concept of reputation here, because I think in the case of Hungary, it's quite clear to me that there's a massive gap between how visible the country has become, how much it has seemingly asserted itself internationally, and how its reputation has plummeted, right? So that is, of course, exactly this kind of example. And, you know, it's very clear that the long-term planning of building a positive reputation has sort of gone a bit haywire. And that is, of course, something that I think for all of us who happen to come from that country is a very serious concern nowadays, right? I don't think the reputation of the country has been as bad as it is today for a number of reasons. At the very same time, it's more in the international media and more perceived as a relevant actor than ever before, right? Not even after 1956 was Hungary in the news more than these days, right? And that's, of course, a negative thing.
Well, I don't have an answer to the question. I rather have a question. We discuss Orban and Kaczynski in Hungary and Poland as almost as if it is self-evident, but I would be interested in what do you see as the basic reasons why these populist parties showed such prominence also at the governmental level in these two countries in Central Europe? Why there and why not anywhere else in Europe, actually?
Slovakia.
And Slovakia, of course, yeah, sure.
Andrej Babiš of ANO in the Czech Republic.
Why there?
One reason, right. One reason is this disparity. So, you know, what we said, the side effect of economic neoliberal development, which was very fast. I'm not economist, so I cannot compare for you all the countries, but this is what a lot of people mention when we talk about Poland. But
well, one explanation which always sounded to me quite persuasive is that in these two countries you had reform communists having negotiated exits in 1989, and that created a very strong cleavage between the post-communists and the nationalist right-wing illiberal or populist forces. And the generational dynamic was that the post-communist left, which actually kept power well into the post-communist period, declined. And they managed to build a hegemony, at least temporarily, in Poland. I think, in a way, more durably in Hungary, I should say. That's at least certainly what it looks like today. And I think that 1989 story and what follows from that may explain precisely why these two countries had it, right? They were the pioneers of 1989, and they turn around. And I think thinking about it like this, as a kind of sequence, may help you explain it, perhaps. But probably there's also more accidents than we like to admit as social scientists and historians.
To maybe add, like another explanation one also hears very often, of course, is the sense of national trauma and the idea of national greatness, right? Both Hungary and Poland have had and Poland. You know, Poland still has some aspirations of being a middle-sized power. Hungary used to be, of course, a much bigger country, etc. We can talk about Trianon and all these things, which those sentiments do not very much apply to any of the other countries, or most of the other countries, I would guess. So maybe there's also a reason, perhaps there, just offering. Yeah, the girl there in the back. Okay, you know who's first.
Oh, sorry, no, I can. Oh, okay. Hi, Ilya Freudenthal here. So, political science student, third year at the UFA. So, I was just wondering, when you said, like, the change in the kind of permissible discourses that was happening in Central and Eastern Europe with regards to, like, Russia policy, like, I just wanted to specify that, like, because that's quite interesting, actually. So, what's the nature of that? Does that mean that there's suddenly, like, license to I don't know, like any kind of, like, I don't know, like post-colonial, decolonial reckoning, or is it like a type of, like, xenophobia that's playing out, or what's the nature of that? I was just trying to, yeah, that's my question.
Well, I think you're actually pointing your finger at the most important, or one of the most important debates at the moment, right? What is this very, clear and serious support for Ukraine and rejection of Russian imperialism? Is this a sign of something like a new form of cultural exclusivism? Something that has to do with Russophobia and so on, or is it a serious critical project of decolonization, dealing with the imperial past? And honestly, I think it's both at the same time. And that's what makes it so interesting, right? I think these two things are merged. And I think there's really an open debate whether you see it as a kind of very positive, kind of progressive trend, or as something that actually only reproduces that idea that some are Europeans and others are not.
I just agree, and it will be, of course, very different in different countries. It will be different in countries that were part of the Soviet Union, that weren't, depending on their position. But that's something to watch and study.
Okay. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Teodora Gaidita. I'm actually also your colleague. I teach at Leiden University, International Studies. And I would like to ask you a question about the internal dynamics at the EU institutions. So there was a joint statement a few months ago on the qualified majority voting in the Common Security and Foreign Policy Council. And actually, quite a few Western European countries signed this initiative, including the Netherlands and Spain, Luxembourg, and actually also Slovenia, but not other countries. So would you like to comment on that? What would be the reasons not to have a qualified majority voting? Of course, the security reasons, but also maybe why the Eastern European countries might actually consider having the qualified majority voting in foreign policy Council. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question, and something, this is what I've been doing all my, the main line of my research, the decision-making in the Council and the significance of unanimity. And here I have to say that I was a bit surprised by that. There is also a study that came out of European Parliament on that, on one of the committees. And I understand the reasons, especially thinking of future enlargement, why this is being kind of pushed, but it's a very dangerous game. And I think this is what some countries in Central Eastern Europe see. And there is a lot of informal norms in the Council that really are the glue to the whole system working. And the negotiations operate in the shadow of the veto, right? Not in the shadow of QMV. It is very, very different when you have qualified majority voting. You can basically, it's a different atmosphere at the table, right? And what you might lose when you actually introduce QMV is the ownership of every state. Right? That's once decision I taken, I own it, I feel part of it. And I think at least these are the arguments that are raised in some part in the region. It's difficult for me to understand, why the logic, why some countries, small countries, big countries, it's difficult to follow. For me, some of them, I am very surprised they would sign it, right? So I cannot answer you this question. I can just say it's a dangerous reform, and it has to be very well thought through.
Maybe just to add to this, again, much more, I think, serious and in-depth expertise of Karolina on this question, I think you have to also remember that, most of the states that created what becomes the European Union have been around for a long time. Whereas for these Central and Eastern European countries, basically their national independence and wanting to be part of Europe basically happened in a package. Right, 1989, well, think of Slovakia, right? A country that becomes independent in 1993 becomes a member of the European Union 11 years later. And so these two things were always seen as something that were very much a package that you wanted to keep. So I think that's also what you see in the politics today, right? They want to be part of the EU, but they also want to have an EU where national independence or some form of sovereignty is still there, for better or worse.
Yeah, I was triggered by what Karolina said. If I understood you correctly, you said that the discussion on qualified majority voting, that's a dangerous game.
Yeah, introducing QMV to the system.
Oh, that's an interesting position. Okay, all right. I just wanted to know that.
Why?
Well, I mean, usually, generally, we see no alternative anymore to qualified majority voting, also in the sphere of security and defense policies, or foreign and security policies, it's better to put it that way. And even Scholz, I think, recently argued for qualified majority voting. And I understand your argument, losing of ownership, perhaps, but there is a counter-argument, of course, and that is creating a more effective and more efficient mode of decision-making. I was intrigued by the fact that you called it a very dangerous game, while most of our colleagues, including those who work on the European Union and European Union decision-making processes, consider it almost inevitable.
Yes, but many think it's not a good idea. It came up with the study of the European Parliament. When you read one of the study, is really, really one of the experts, and also the kind of literature there. Yeah, it might be inevitable politically, but I think this is a decision that came out of being fed up of Hungarians, of Poles being difficult, sometimes others, right? And I think the problem was different. Because the problem were the populist, and democratic governments, and what they were doing had nothing to do with discussions in Brussels and everything to do with what they were doing at home. And the problem was the rule of law, right? So what I think this whole kind of now looking for solution and again messing up decision-making problem is addressing, a decision-making system is addressing the wrong problem, which is dealing with the rule of law. We have a mechanism that would solve it, right? In the case of Hungary, we have Article 7. If there is a regime that is not democratic anymore, that is undermining the very foundations of democracy, there is a clear procedure to deal with that. And that would solve the problem because Hungary wouldn't have a vote, right? And I know this is very radical, but in effect, this is what they are trying to achieve kind of through going around. Because nobody really wants to use this kind of nuclear bomb of Article 7, but introducing QMV will change a lot in the informal ways in which negotiations are done and how consensual they are, right? It might turn into hard bargaining, right? And especially with security, we might expect drop, in support for that policy.
I think we will go to the last question, and then we can continue the discussion with a drink in our hands. Who would like to take the floor? I see several hands. Oh, this is very difficult. You were kind of first. I am very, very sorry. Yeah, the guy in the back. Yeah. Sorry, ma'am.
Hello. This might be a very broad question, but personally, maybe it's ignorance on my side, but I've always been quite surprised by Hungary's behavior with regards to the war in Ukraine and relations with Russia, with its let's say, well, neutral is a vague word, but sort of very different stance compared to Poland. And you were discussing about the weight of history versus current politicians. Okay, this is very broad, but how would you explain this? Why does Hungary hold such a different position from Poland? Would a political change generate a significant change because it's mainly due to current political dynamics? And equally with Poland, is it so based in history, sort of support or rejection of Russian positions? And yes, I was wondering with these two countries, mainly on Hungary, but how does history and current politics interact with that? Does a political change in the nearby future potentially generate a different position also on this geopolitical matter?
Excellent question.
Right. I mean, I would certainly say that, if you asked me 20 years ago how likely it is that the Hungarian nationalist right would be considered somewhat pro-Russian or even supporting certain Russian revisionist ambitions, I would have said that's extremely unlikely. So I don't think you can explain it historically. I think you can probably explain it politically. I think where it gets maybe more interesting and perhaps also more controversial from a certain point of view, I like to say that, Orban was doing more or less what Germany was doing in a slightly more extreme way until early 2022. And I think the real divergence happened with the so-called Zeitenwende, right, when Germany announced that it's sort of turning around and introducing a new kind of epoch, with the famous Scholz speech and so on. Until that point, I think the idea was, well, very much the mainstream one in Germany, that you have to have good economic ties to Russia, also to China. These are, countries that are growing in the early 21st century. Europe needs to, Wandel durch Handel and so on, try to achieve that. And Orban was basically going along with that. Now, why he didn't change his policy early last year, that's of course the big mystery to a lot of us. Part of the reason, I think nobody can really explain because we don't know what's going on behind the scenes very well. One thing that's for sure is that the Russian war of aggression happened during the Hungarian electoral campaign, right? And interestingly enough, Orban ended up benefiting from this massive war of aggression against a neighboring country, where you probably would have expected that it will be very bad for his chances of getting re-elected. That's not what turned out. And his main line was, this war has nothing to do with us, and we want to stay out of it. And other countries are doing a lot to drag us into that war, right? This is, of course, the kind of pacifist line that, by the way, was also quite vocal in Germany at the time. And he was also, in a way, trying to connect himself to that. But, of course, again, Germany has certainly turned around in quite significant ways since. And therefore, I think he remained in an extremely unenviable position of being sort of the person with the worst reputation on this. And he's holding on to this stance, which I find difficult to explain.
Can I ask you something as a follow-up? Is he doing it to get things like, to just get things out of the EU? That he says he drops a lot of these objections, he drops, but is he doing that strategically to just gain something?
Well, there certainly has been a lot of speculation about whether that's his game plan. I think, on the one hand, it might be that he's trying to, so to say, bargain for more. He's trying to raise the stakes. I would say it's quite unclear. I think if the EU decides not to give him what he has been receiving, so to say, and what helped him to build up his regime, because I think that's also part of the story we have to mention here. I mean, Poland and Hungary were, ironically enough, major beneficiaries of European structural funds and so on, while these illiberal regimes were running the show in these countries. So, of course, for Orban, it's now very clear that he might lose that. And if he loses that access to the budget, what is his reason to stay, right? We don't quite know whether he would want to adjust to get to be on better terms with European institutions. He might, because he's an opportunistic politician, right? And he probably thinks in terms of interest, but it might also be that the separation will continue.
Okay, I think we bring it to a close. Thanks a lot, first of all, to the panelists. Thanks a lot for your great contributions. It was a very interesting discussion. Thanks a lot to the audience as well, also for the interesting questions at the very end. I would say let us move down from the stage, let's take a drink and let's chat on about this interesting, very interesting region a little bit more. So thanks a lot to you all.